Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Back in 1978, a reporter, a Fleet Street reporter no less, called Leslie Watkins, wrote a book. And the book was based on a television documentary that had gone out, a documentary about Mars. And that documentary had received a lot of publicity. It had shocked a lot of people. And then it was declared to be a hoax, a kind of a mockumentary. But Leslie Watkins didn't think it was a mockumentary, and he set out to find out the truth behind it. And what he found was a secret plan to evacuate Earth, people disappearing, fake photographs of Mars, and scientists disappearing off the face of the Earth. Those claims were made in the book Alternative 3, first published in 1978. Now, that book and that documentary are the subject of a recent film which I've been watching today. It's outstanding, in fact, produced and directed by and starring our guest tonight, who's in Germany, as I said a bit earlier on. The film is called Packing for Mars, and it's brilliant. It really is. I've not finished it. I'm 2/3 of the way through it, but I've enjoyed it immensely today. It's incredibly thought-provoking and eye-opening at times as well. Let's welcome the man responsible for it to the programme. He is Frank Jacob. Frank, you are very welcome. Welcome to the programme.
Hello, Richie. Great to be here. Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
The honour is mine. I didn't know what to make of the film. I had no idea what to expect when I sat down, but let me congratulate you on it. It is terrific, Frank. It is. Like
Thank
I
you
said,
very much.
I'm 2/3 of the way through it. I'm going to either watch the rest of it tonight or possibly early tomorrow morning. But I'm delighted to have seen it, and I'm delighted that you're here to talk about why you made it. Tell us about coming across Leslie Watkins and his book and the original television documentary that Watkins was to write about. How did you come across this, Frank?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. I actually, at the time that I found out about the book before I found out about the TV program, and I was introduced to it by kind of a sort of an intellectual alternative farmer guy who I used to go to for certain seeds. I was interested in health, using finding new ways to improve your health using food. And this one guy, at one of our meetings, suddenly, just sort of goes off the deep end, and we got into an interesting conversation area, and he pulls out this book, and he's like going on ranting about this book and proceeds to tell me about how it's not science fiction. It was just said that it was science fiction, but that it was all true, and that there was a TV show that came out on supposedly April Fool's Day in 1977. And it was amazing. And he gave me the book to take along, and I read it. And of course, it's it's a page turner, right? It's one of these books that you just, first of all, the background of it, having someone tell me that it's not science fiction, but that it's actually just masking as science fiction, was enough to get me interested in reading it. But it really is, on its own merits, a very well written book, and it's something that opens your mind up to a lot of, I guess probably that's one of the first times in my life where I kind of got a glimpse of what now is sort of emerging in the media with the label deep state. But I guess this book has kind of a correlation in the sense that it's not politics. It might be considered like a deep science secrecy or something going on the planet. So you kind of have to open yourself up to that idea, which I did. But, at the time of my life, I didn't really think that I was going to be making a film about it. I just thought it's cool, but I mean, you're not really going to be able to convince people around you who are integrated in a normal kind of society that this is true, and let alone trying to convince them to make a film about it or whatever. So that's kind of where it sat for many years.
Do you know, it's incredible. The TV show went out on Anglia Television, which is in the east of the country. And doing a bit of research today, before I began watching the film, I probably should have watched the entire film and then done the research. But I'm an Irishman, Frank, and we do things back to front sometimes. But yeah, there was a weekly TV show called Science Report, and this was a serious television show. on Anglia television, and the episode Alternative 3 was part of this television show called Science Report, and there was no reason to at that time to think that this was in any way a mockumentary or a hoax. It went out, and it also went out in Australia and I think it went out in Canada as well, and other places. Canada. And it had a profound effect.
Once in Japan.
And talk to us about the effect. And now this is before Leslie Watkins wrote about it. Talk about the effect it had on people. People were up in arms about it. They were contacting the networks. They wanted to know more. It had a huge impact, didn't it?
It did, and I think it was like the British version. I like to think of it as kind of like the British version of the War of the Worlds. It was, and like you said, it was a show that every week had done these factual science reports. It was even called Science Report. So people, didn't have a heads-up warning. And the thing is, David Ambrose and Christopher Miles, who wrote the screenplay, kind of as their going out show, were in a sort of pseudo-cynical way trying to tell people or say to people that they believe anything they see on television. And I think that was kind of that's their sort of argument for why they made the show and didn't make any announcements prior to releasing it. But yeah, I mean, tens of thousands of people called in, outraged, and it just really set things on fire to the point where the television station, it goes back in a long enough time in history that there really are a lot of uncertainties about, what exactly did take place and why the TV station took a about turn and said, no, it's all fake. We just made the whole thing up. And of course they dramatized it. And of course they used actors. But Leslie Watkins, who was listening, who actually, I interviewed him many years later. In fact, after we released Packing for Mars. And I wanted to hear it from him. And I wanted to know how it impacted him. And he happened to, as a Fleet Street reporter, he said he never really watched television. But on this particular evening, he watched this show, and it just struck him, struck a chord in him. And he felt like he always suspected that there wasn't something right about what we were being told about the space program. And his publisher approached him with the idea of looking into it and expanding on the concepts in the television program. And that's how that all came about. Let's just remind our listeners, and in some cases we won't be reminding them, we'll be telling them new information. But the show was about, it was suggested in the show that there was research to show that interplanetary space travel had been possible for much longer than was commonly accepted. That was one thing. It was also suggested that scientists who had worked on a secret American-Soviet kind of a joint space operation, scientists had gone missing. And then, of course, the Mars stuff. I mean, it must have blown people's minds at the time. So before we talk about you deciding then to retrace the steps of Leslie Watkins and find the latter day evidence that, there is truth to this about the colonization of Mars, about the plans for evacuation to Mars. What sort of stuff did Leslie Watkins find out when he started looking into it? What led him to believe that the production company were telling lies, that it was a serious broadcast and that they had changed their minds, maybe because they were being pressurized by other agents of the state maybe, to suddenly claim, oh, well, look, it was just a hoax, it was all a joke? What led Watkins to believe that it wasn't a hoax, that it was an original and true and real documentary? How did he come to discover that, Frank? Well, I mean, going into it, Leslie didn't actually go into it believing it. The thing is, he went into it thinking he was going to just write a more in-depth sci-fi. And I mean, because I said to him, come on, Leslie, like a lot of people thought he was the author of this book, was part of the, the secret government, spoon feeding and drip feeding disclosure through fictional novels. And I called him on it, and he denied it. He said he definitely did not go into it with the mindset that he was, writing a true thing. He went into it writing a fiction. And there's two things that happened to him that kind of freaked him out. Well, three in the end. But while he was writing the book, he started noticing that his phones were being tapped. And it made him feel very uncomfortable because he started doing research, and he's a very meticulous researcher. I mean, you don't get to be a Fleet Street reporter, I guess, at least in the days of where journalism was a little bit more, authentic than you might say it is these days. But he really, really did his research. The other thing he found that freaked him out was he found a lot of reports of people gone missing people. And not just a few dozen here or a few dozen there, or those people who want to go missing and disappear. No, these were millions of people missing. And it would seem to correlate to the idea that if they're going to build this colony on Mars and they have the technology to transport people there, they need bodies. They need bodies to build those things. And the missing people thing kind of haunted him and made him dig a lot deeper. And I think in the end, what happened is after he published the book, he was getting calls from politicians saying, jolly good, Leslie, you've done it. How did you get this out? We've known about this and no one could talk about it. Who authorized you? And he was like, no. I just made the whole thing up. I made the whole thing up. And I go, yeah, we know you have to say that, right? Right. And there was another guy in the book who actually who he called up for his research, and he went to his house talking about the disappearance of his son. And they actually had like a story about this son of theirs that went off to Australia, and they tried to track him down for some job, and he was gone. And they were never able to get back anything. They got postcards from him, and he noticed that the postcards were always coming from one particular address, even though this kid was moving around. And it's very interesting when he told me that, because I recall a story from another person that I know very well, who's a scientist in Germany, many years later, was telling me the story, unrelated, about a really respected scientist he knew that was called to the United States to apparently go look at some kind of secret technology. And they made him write postcards and post date them and write these postcards for a whole year and give them the stack of postcards that they could then mail for him on his behalf when he was away, saying that he was just away on a vacation. So this seems to be a modus operandi that they used. And the other thing that happened to Leslie, when he then left England and went and moved to New Zealand, all of his stuff, he had compiled, people had written them from all over the world when the book came out. People like, there was a lot of politicians, like I was saying, and there was a lot of letters from readers. Some people were outraged, some people didn't believe it. But there were some people like, for example, Mae Brussell, who was an American icon investigative journalist. I mean, this is the high brass of investigative journalism. Mae Brussell, for example, to give you an idea of the credibility of her, she approached Robert Kennedy with information that would lead to evidence that somebody was trying to kill him 2 weeks before he was actually shot. She's very thorough, and she read the book, and there's a quote, you can see it in the trailer, that she says she considered Alternative 3 the most dangerous book on her shelf at the time. Incredible. So it seems to me like, all of these things combined make me believe that Leslie, regardless of whether he was like documenting something he'd been authorized to leak, or whether his story, which I believe him, is true, that he was just accidentally stumbling on the truth, we have to realize is that we're all living in this magnetic field around us, and we've now learned that the magnetic field holds the resonant frequency of all of the thoughts of all time, of all people. So they might be able to keep it secret, off of the media waves and off of black and white paper and stuff, but the information is out there, and maybe Leslie was just tuning in it and channeling it into his book.
He was dialed into it, yeah. This is fascinating stuff. Frank Jacob is on the line. Go to packingformarsmovie.com. That's the official website, and that is where you can rent a copy of the film. My word is gold. I'm 2/3 of the way through it, and it is fascinating. It really is. It's an incredible story, a brilliant journey. Marvelous, really, when you think that this show went out in 1977. Then Leslie wrote the book saying that the show was more accurate than it was letting on. It wasn't a hoax. And all these years later, then Frank having, would you say it was a naturopath or, an alternative medicine practitioner who gave Frank the book? Was that it, Frank? And that's how you got into it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's incredible. Packingformarsmovie.com. So tell me then, Frank, where do you start then? I mean, I've made television shows before, but they've been live television shows, and I occasionally made features which lasted for 15, 20 minutes. Difficult, might take a day to make it. It's a difficult thing. Where did you start with a project as massive as this? The film runs over 2 hours. It's incredible. Where did you begin, Frank? Because you're thinking, right, I'm going to have to validate this information today, in 2015, in 2016. Where do I begin? How did you do that?
Yeah. I came to Europe thinking that I was going to get away from all things like deep state, because I'd been kind of interested in probing behind, the truth of what is being. I've always been kind of suspicious and skeptical about the picture of reality being painted by the mainstream. And when I came to Europe, I mean, it kind of got to such a stress point in my life that I said, that's it, I'm done with this. I want to just be a normal person, and I'm going to come to Europe, I'm going to be normal. And I tried it, and I was miserable at it, failed. I kept noticing people all around kind of freaking out at events going on, wondering, how is this happening? How is this happening? And I kind of had this gut feeling like I knew why. But basically, I think I was re-triggered by watching a Barcelona, by a thing called exopolitics, which had emerged starting in 2006 with Stephen Greer. And then I saw this Barcelona exopolitics conference with two people heading up something called Project Camelot, which was Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy. And here were these people that were, like bona fide, solid psychological profile people that normally would never be talking about crazy things like UFOs or paranormal experiences, detailing the reality that there was this other technology. There was this secret space program. And this sort of kind of shook me up a little bit. But I didn't do much about it. I just kind of kept going. And I was looking at the same time, I wanted to do a film. I'd done music. I'd done live visuals. I'd done a bunch of things. I was working at a network, just as an editor. But I really wanted to do something like a feature documentary. So I was looking, but I needed a thread. I mean, the exopolitics thing was interesting. And I always felt that it was sad that a lot of the footage and a lot of the information coming, out about this kind of information tended to be relegated to some really bad quality YouTube clip or something. Yeah. And I felt it was time that somebody, did like a cinematic, like cool, arty thing, but I didn't know what yet. But I wanted to make something that was artsy and really interesting to look at and sounded cool. And then one night I was surfing around the web and I hear this woman talking about having been recruited for a Mars colony, and she happened to be. She was called Laura Eisenhower, and I thought, okay, and she was saying she was the great granddaughter of President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yeah, she's been on the show. Yeah, Laura's been here. She's been on the show. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that made me sit up and take notes. That was the first, okay, come on, like, is this real? Right? It's like here is somebody who's come forward, who's of pedigree, saying that they actually were recruited for this Mars colony. For me, that was it. I knew then at that moment it all came back. The book, Alternative 3, and it was like a sleeping giant for me. This book, I was surprised that until then no one had ever taken up this storyline and no one had ever explored it because there was so much mythology about it. There was just this thing is just pregnant with mythology. So I figured, okay, look, I'm going to try and reach this woman, Laura Eisenhower, and I'm going to reach out wherever I can find something on the internet. I'll try to read, and my answer from the universe will be, if she writes back to me within 24 hours, it's a clear green light for me to pursue the project. So I did exactly that, and she actually, I got an email from her. I wrote, and she actually wrote back this letter and said, "Yeah, let's do this. This sounds great." And I was just, I was amazed. So that's how it all started. And then I just, I knew then, it would require a lot of research. research, but like the line in the film, like, the universe will open the door for a fool wishing to know a secret. I figured if I equipped myself really well, so I bought some high quality portable film equipment and some good audio gear, because I knew that sound had to be good in these films, otherwise people don't take them seriously, especially documentaries. And I just knew that somehow it would all work out. And I'd gotten in touch with this guy, Alfred Lambermont Weber, another person who's very deeply into exopolitics. I think he's one of the founders of the exopolitical movement. He took up a liking to me and my idea. And he said, okay, come on out to Vancouver. I'll hook you up with some people. And that's kind of how it started. And then eventually, about 10 days into the filming process, I was routed to a location where I wasn't supposed to actually be staying at this person's place, but I sort of was like a last-ditch moment where I ended up staying there. And at that location, I ran into another very, very critical and powerful person involved in the production of the film, and that's Tanya Maidenford. And it was just a total fluke that we met. I was sitting there at this friend of hers house showing some of the rushes I'd shot that day, and we got into a conversation. I had no idea who she was. And I was on my desktop were some icons of some of the films that I'd seen, one of them being UFO, The Greatest Story Untold, right? The one with Jose Escamilla's films. And she asked me about that. And as it turns out, I said, well, Jose's he makes these amazing films about anomalies on the moon and stuff. He's definitely someone I got to try and get in touch with. Well, as it turns out, Tanya Maidenford produced all of the Jose Escamilla films. So here I was sitting, by fluke, 12,000, kilometers away from where I came from, 10 days into the journey with somebody who opened me up to a whole new gate of people.
It was meant to be, wasn't it, Frank? Your meeting with Tanya was absolutely meant to be, no doubt about that. Wonderful synchronicity.
Absolutely.
Wonderful synchronicity. I just want to mention, there are a lot of tweets coming in. I expected they would be. My listeners, and I'm not patronising them, my listeners are amazing. I mean, they really are. They ask brilliant questions. But they're also curious about, your interaction with and your knowledge of other people. So I'm not going to, because obviously our time is finite, I won't, spend too much time asking you, and what do you think of him and what do you think of her and all that. But people are mentioning names like Stephen Greer and Corey Good and many others who've talked about Mars. I'm sure you're aware of these people, Frank, and I'm sure you've come across their work and their investigations before. Frank Jacob was on the line. packingformarsmovie.com is the official website. It's a very, very beautiful film to look at. I'm glad you mentioned Artie, because I said if I mentioned Artie, you might think I was being critical of it. I'm not critical when I say Artie. It is beautiful to look at. And cleaning it up, Frank, you mentioned about YouTube. There is some wonderful stuff on YouTube about these subjects. But if you took it to somebody who gets all their information from commercial media, they wouldn't watch it, Frank, because it looks dreadful. This is a huge problem in the so-called independent media. It's one we've tried to address on our television and radio shows. We aim to mirror the production values of the mainstream. Not that we want to copy them, far from it, but we need to sound as if we would fit neatly into the schedule of a commercial radio station. If we don't, nobody's going to bloody listen. And what you've achieved with your film is you've achieved that very thing. It looks cinematic and it's wonderful. Now I want you to talk about, because some of our listeners are saying, what is the compelling physical evidence, before we talk about some of the men and women who you interviewed and talked about their experiences and the whistleblowers, what is would you say, the overwhelming physical evidence that exists through photography that Mars is not what we were told it actually is?
At the time that I was starting the film, and when Tanya and I continued, it took us 5 years to make the film, by the way, just so you know how long something like this takes. I mean, okay, it's like if you're not being paid by some major studio to make the film, or you haven't saved, or you're not independently wealthy, like you have to kind of, you really have to work long hours and many, many years to try and get it done and put a lot of money and time and effort into it. Fortunately for us, both of us together have combined skill sets to be able to pull something like this off at the quality, which we're really happy about. And that's kind of that's sort of our personal mission. We, like you were saying earlier, we want to have that standard. But you know, at the time that we started it, there really wasn't a lot of photographic evidence, but there was a lot of stuff on the moon, and that's why Jose Escamilla is in the film talking about that. But there was also stuff that was being put out by a guy called J.P. Skipper. And he was doing some really, he had this website called Mars Anomaly Research, I think is what it was called. And for a long time, he sort of disappeared now, but for a long time, he was putting out some really compelling photographic forensic evidence that made it clear that the picture we were being sold about how things are on Mars can't really be true. And, you know, so on the one hand, you have that, and you look at that. But I didn't want that to be like the main focus, because there really for a long time was a lot of photographic material which you looked at and you said, yeah, that's a rock. You know, I mean, it's not all of it is, you know, some petrified skull or something. Yeah. But you know, if you look at that evidence and you combine it with the whole thing about it is tying the threads. And you know, the film is really a journey that follows a certain thread, and we try to pull in research that backs up what might be going on here as much as possible. I mean, we have J.J. Hertog in there talking about archaeology, about the history of Mars, that there's this relationship between Earth and Mars that you know could go back millions of years for all we know. We don't really know exactly what the time stamp is on the stuff, because a lot of the stuff that's found is in rock. It's etched in rocks, and rocks are good for that, because rocks allow you to put something permanently on the record that won't be like if you throw an iPhone on the ground and come back in 200 years, you can be sure it's gone. Yeah. But if you etch something into rock, you know, it's there. So there was a lot of so there's artifacts that have emerged, which you know, we found out through some contacts of Tanya's that have now been actually scientifically dated to being somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 BC, that clearly show what looks to be aliens or ET-like beings, humanoid beings, traveling in ships, and not just like kind of weird-looking things that might be ships, whatever. These things actually have control panels and doors and glass, you know, surrounding pilot cockpit things, and there's wormholes and planetary configurations. There's things like that kind of back up some of the stories that are a little bit more far out, like Jerry Wills is recounting his experience to me about having been visited by people that claimed that he was brought there by him at his birth and has basically been implanted into Earth as an extraterrestrial, and his memories that he had growing up, that his being told the story about this civilization on Mars. And there's also been some interesting documents that have emerged recently from the CIA's Freedom of Information pool that show that the CIA in the 1980s was seriously interested in remote viewing the ancient past of Mars. Now you have to ask yourself, what would the CIA be interested in researching about Mars in the 80s, unless there's a possibility that the story that these people are talking about a colonization on Mars, which started happening sometime we think around the 70s, and onward up through to this day, was real. For example,
do you know, Frank, when friends of mine who don't pay much attention to this program and the guests on it, they often say, if there was a colonization program, Richie, how could that not get out? And I often make the point, and I mention, people like you and others, Frank, and I say, well, maybe it did get out, but they depend on a couple of things. And one of the things, of course, is the inherent incredulity that we all carry around with us. You could show somebody compelling evidence that the government was involved in secret space programs, the colonization of Mars, preparing and engineering other planets for human habitation. You could show them compelling evidence, but because of our limitations in terms of our sense of what's possible, which is, beaten out of us not physically but mentally through school and all of that. You could show them the compelling evidence, Frank, and they'll still shake their head and say, "Oh no, it's just crazy stuff that This is the world we live in, right?" So I think that's how they've kept it hidden for forever. The many things they do, we're predisposed to just look at it's crazy that no. And that's what you're fighting against, because
you're absolutely right.
You're a wonderful filmmaker. The film is wonderful. And you're talking to these people. And when people watch the film, it's at packingformarsmovie.com. When you watch it, watch it objectively as you can and pay attention to what the many men and women who feature in the film are saying. But what stands out to me, these people are not crazy. There's nothing in it for them in terms of, there's nothing in it from a monetary point of view. There's certainly nothing in it from, socially there is nothing in it for these people other than ridicule and finger pointing. These people are compelling in the matter of fact and very, very the wonderful narratives these people tell about what they learned and what they know. That's what strikes me, Frank. Watching your film, and I think...
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm glad you say that, and I'm glad you're bringing this up, because, this is the problem that I think a lot of people have, and the reason also why Tanya and I chose to make the film secret. Even for the entire 5 years we were working on it, we didn't even tell our friends and family about it, because you tell people kind of what the premise is and that you're making a film about this, and they really start to look at you sideways. But, like you were saying, these people, whatever their story is, I felt, they needed a chance to tell their story without judgment, because we always, a lot of times people approach you and say, well, you should have the other side, the other side of the argument. We've only been hearing the other side of the argument. The line is drawn so clear, Richie, between people who believe in some such things.
That's right.
And those who are holding on for dear life to the limited, narrow perspective they are being sold in the educational system and on television through the mainstream and political spectrum, that they just refuse to go there. And that's why in the film, Tanya was saying, oh, you need to have a spiritual element into it, and we found, a very interesting part of the film is when we sit there and talk to Bikbai and Nijnema, and he's going on about the Dogon.
Yes,
he's one of the Dogon tribe initiates for the listeners, and the Dogon tribe in Africa is baffling for a lot of people, because they have knowledge of the star constellation of Orion, including orbiting planets within the obvious sun system that we see in the stars, that they had like hundreds of years before we even invented telescopes that could even see into space. So he was interesting, and he says that the Dogon tribe has a word for it, and they call it Zenimti. And that's exactly what you're talking about. You can sit there and you can tell somebody, this is what's going on. Hey, look, this is what's going on. This is what's happening to you. It's obvious. And, the people, they'll not only say, oh, yeah, they don't want to do anything about it, but they'll even argue for why they should stay in the situation that they're in. And this is kind of like where a lot of people, I think we're in a part in society and an evolution as a society right now where we really are drawing the lines, where there's a line between those people holding on for dear life to one way of looking at things and those people who are saying, no, this ain't working anymore, man. This is just not working. And there's something going on. It's just, when you look at, like, for example, the whole NASA program with the rovers, they've got all these rovers up there, and they've got primarily geologists looking at rocks and dust up there. And here they are driving by and photographing artifacts, which now in later years, getting back to the point earlier, there's a really great website, for people that want to check it out, called Exclusive Mars Images, and on Facebook. And they are showing us some of the stuff the Curiosity rover is photographing now. And you just have to shake your head and go, like, NASA, like, don't you see that just could not be rocks? And it's just, there's this non-position by those that are in the positions of power to acknowledge it. And they just rely, and the word for that, I think, is cognitive dissonance. We have this inability to even if we're confronted with the truth, we prefer to continue living the lie because all our buddies are living the lie together and we're all living happy in the big lie. It's don't disturb the boat. We're fine. Don't come in with your crazy ideas because it's gonna, people are afraid. And I think it goes back to maybe it's a DNA thing. When we were living in the Ice Age and we knew that if we were cast out from the tribe, you're imminently, going to die, because the only way you're going to survive is if you're living with the tribe. Your chances of getting food and warding off bears or dinosaurs or whatever it was are much higher in the tribe. And so to be in the tribe, you're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of individuality to survive. And this sort of survival DNA thing, I think, is still deeply in us. And it doesn't really have to be a conspiracy. I think it's just sort of natural tendency for us not to want to go there.
No doubt about it. I just want to mention again, Frank Jacob, the producer, director, and the star, not that he would say he's a star, of the film Packing for Mars. Go to packingformarsmovie.com, is on the line. We've got about 6-7 more minutes left on this. It really is a fascinating and thought-provoking and brilliantly shot film. It really is. Several, I wouldn't say several, but one or two of the men and women who appear in the film have been on this program in the recent past, and like Frank was saying, and I want to make this point again, their testimonies are compelling. One of the things the standard I hold for this program is, if I believe that the person I'm speaking with, they believe their own story, if I believe that they believe their own story, I will listen to them all day long. And the compelling thing about Frank's film is the many contributors to the film, they believe what it is they're telling you. They absolutely believe it. And it's fascinating.
Well, there's a legal process. It's like in a court of law, the proceedings, basically, if there's no evidence, the court still weighs in on the testimony of the people that are coming to the witness stand. And of course, that testimony and the weight of the case you're trying to prove improves with the amount of testimonials that you have to support the story. And in the recent years, it is uncanny how many people have come forward and begun talking about this wild chapter of apparently humans' space ventures that have to do with Mars, that totally contradicts what we've been told by society. So I think it's another reason that we wanted to make the film is we just needed to document this, because regardless of if it's true or not true, we're not even trying to make an opinion in the film. We're just showing you the stuff that's out there. It is really a journey. Like, this guy goes on this journey with a backpack and he wants to know. So you're confronted in the wild with this information. So you just kind of have to let it go through, and because it's part of putting it on the record, and part of putting it on the record brings it up for discussion. And we're never going to crack through this sort of wall of conformity unless we're opening ourselves up to looking at maybe some of the more crazy ideas that are out there.
You mentioned earlier on, Frank, about the electromagnetic spectrum, and you mentioned about the information being everywhere. I love that. I love that image. It's there. You've just got to reach out to it, or if you open yourself up to it, it'll come to you. Do you think that might speak to to use the word plethora, the massive volume of science fiction films and television programs that we've seen in recent years? I went to see, I think Amy Adams is the star, Arrival, which is about, I'm the worst guy in the world now. People get different things from films, but for me, it was all about how the space-time continuum is not linear in any way at all. It's the time is not linear. This wonderful science fiction film, and I loved it. Is this information actually conscious by itself, and is it penetrating the minds of talented people like you, Frank, people working in Hollywood to make these films? Are we being communicated with through the medium of Hollywood film and Hollywood television? What do you think?
Well, I think absolutely we are. I mean, there's several ways you can look at that statement. On the one hand, I know that when I'm working on a particular section of a film, and I feel I've connected with something, it's an unbelievable feeling you have when the information is coming in. You, at one point, you kind of feel like these aren't necessarily your own thoughts any longer. These are like you're tuning into a radio station, of information, and it's just funneling through you, and you just have to try and capture it as much as possible. I believe that's, and I know scientifically now there's a foundation for that. But the other thing I think which is happening is, poor Stephen Bassett was really trying to push disclosure through, on the official channels to have some kind of an announcement from the president or of the United States. And it just, I think it was frustrating because in the end it fell flat because it's just not going to happen that way. So I believe that in Hollywood, a lot of the, and I know this, from conversations with even people like J.J. Hertog, that Gene Roddenberry and people like that were privy to information that was being leaked out through them specifically to drop into cultural shows to try and bring the disclosure in a very soft and subtle way, so that one day when they do feel that they're ready to release the information, people won't panic. I think that's still the biggest thing. They somehow feel it'll destabilize the population. It'll destabilize civilization if they release the information. Not only that, but it'll set off a massive rebellion against government, because people will be outraged that for 60 or 70 years now we probably would have had the answers to free energy and wireless communication and a whole era of space travel that we've known nothing about, and that we would have been able to avoid wars and banking crises and oil and all these things going around the planet if we'd known this. So I think this is why they use specifically films and movies to do that. We're doing it sort of the hardcore way. We're not funded by any major film studio. We just feel the inspiration to get the information out, and we feel people need to see the information. They need to talk about the information.
Absolutely.
They can debate with us and talk about it, but in the end, it's about having this discussion.
Frank, it's interesting there you're talking about the information, and we often talk about how we're blocked from receiving it. People talk about the pineal gland and the calcification of that, what fluoride does to us and everything else, and geoengineering. And I used to laugh at this stuff, Frank. There was a time when I would have been I wouldn't have laughed in people's faces. I was never rude like that. But privately, I would have said, these people are crazy. They're just silly, tinfoil hat wearing lunatics. And boy, was I wrong. I mean, we have the evidence now that we're being dumbed down, not just because they don't want us to challenge authority. That is true, of course, but it's because they want to stop that side of us, that openness, that ability to connect with everything else. That has to be stopped. Hence the fluoridation and the vaccines and everything else that bloody well goes with it. And that's why we're not so much open to this. And it's shocking to me. But I want to just say, folks, you can rent the film through Real House. How you do that is go to the website packingformarsmovie.com. You're going to like it. It's terrifically made and directed by Frank himself. I can't say any more about it other than that. Frank, I'll give you the final word on it. And thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about it. It's great. And congratulations on the film. Final word to you, my friend.
Well, thanks. Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that, part of what you just were talking about with this pineal gland calcification and this seemingly deliberate move to dumb us down or to suppress us, I think there's a way around it, and it's happening to us right now. And maybe there's an upside to being stunted in this way, or to having our pineal gland calcified in this way. And that's, we have this sort of mental way of looking at things through logic. It's been kind of, maybe some people call it a reptilian process that we've been engineered to use. But we're not just the mind. We're also the heart and the gut. And we have this ability to sense something beyond mind. So we don't necessarily need to use logic any longer to determine whether something is real or something is true or something has a piece of significance in the treasure chest of information that we're gathering as ships, in the universe. Each individual person has their own collective experiences with us, So I think maybe what we should try to do is steer more away from the absolute relying on logic and opening ourselves up to more the intuition and the heart. And I think the people in the film, they really, we deliberately chose very close camera perspectives because we want to look into their eyes, because I think if you sit up in front of somebody and you have them tell their story, I really wanted to, it was for me, that was the big difference. It's one thing hearing somebody talk on the radio, but it's another thing to come right up close to them, put yourself right in front of them and look into their eyes and have them tell their story, because I think we can all sense something about the proximity to somebody's eyes, and they say
Absolutely.
The eyes are the windows to the soul.
Absolutely right.
And hopefully this message comes across, and gets across to the people watching the film.
Frank, thanks for coming on. I'm sure we'll speak again in the future. Packingformarsmovie.com is the website you need to go to rent the film. Fluffles has tweeted me in the last couple of minutes to say he saw the film last week, saw the movie, thought it was absolutely terrific. That's the website. I will retweet it again. And Frank, congratulations on it. And I can say with all sincerity, I look forward to your next project. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, Richie. All the best to you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Marvellous. Frank Jacob on the line to us there from Germany.